Hans, thank you for taking time to talk with us again. There is a critical situation that's going on inside of Iran right now because of the death of Masa Amini, a young woman who was killed, who supposedly was not wearing her hijab correctly, and that is completely false and bogus, and that has set off protests across the country. What we're hearing now, Hans, is that Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has launched what your organization calls cross-border attacks in Iraq to quell support for this protest movement. What more do you know about this?
Thank you for having me on. Yeah, I mean, the situation in Iran is not an uncritical one, to say the least. There are widespread protests. They are not yet organized and coordinated in the way that these widespread protests were in 2009 and 10, but they are, without a doubt, as far as you can read, the largest and widespread protests since the last time the Green Movement. There were several protests in the past couple of years, but these definitely are larger and more spread out in the country, pretty much in every major city this time. There is, however, in addition to the normal aspect that this case involves, i.e. greater freedom, better economic development, the oppression of the regime in general, there is an ethnic aspect to this as well, because Ms. Amini was from the Kurdish community in Iran, that the regime, as did the Shah regime, always regards very critically, because as you know, the Kurdish nation for many generations tries to become an independent nation. And so the Kurdish communities in Syria, in Turkey, in Iraq, and in Iran are coordinating with each other towards this long-term strategic aim. So there is very clearly a concern in the regime that the chaos that this regime created by overreacting, as it frequently does, to criticism, could spill over into ethnic unrest, precisely at the time where Russian forces withdraw to a certain extent from Syria, and the Kurdish community in Syria prepares for a potential military operation in Turkey. So this is already a very critical regional situation, and these protests in Iran, of course, have the potential to also devolve into ethnic unrest.
Yeah. Hans, the IRGC has been accused in the past of using terrorist tactics against its enemy abroad, and the Quds Force and secret police using similar methods against its opponents. Have you seen any scenario here where this seems to be unfolding?
With the Kurdish areas in Iraq, there's always a specific situation. There is a tacit agreement between the Turkish government in Iraq and the Iranian regime that the Iranian regime can pursue militarily what the regime in Iran terms terrorist groups among Turkish organizations. And one of them, of course, is the group that they are attacking right now, the Turkish Democratic Party of Iran. So this is a straightforward military operation. So it's cross-border shelling, as they've done. I think the agreement is up to 10 kilometers within Kurdistan in Iraq. This shelling is allowed. I'm not yet aware that there are major troop movements across the border, which would be something new.
How does the situation get addressed or fixed, or how can it be addressed? I mean, obviously, the regime is in Iran is not necessarily interested in anything except what it wants, and of course the Kurdish group that's under pressure right now, of course, has what it wants and its issues that are very much important to them and have been for a long time. So how do you get to a point where this tension goes away?
I mean, this is a very complex issue. So let's separate it out into the internal situation in Iran and then the Kurdish issue that came up today. So what I would assess at this particular point, from knowing what we know, this was a warning shot against those Kurdish groups to not try to cross the border into Iran. and or not to try to do any attacks inside Iran while the regime deals with the unrest. Now, as far as the internal situation in Iran is concerned, if there are a couple of things that bear monitoring over the next couple of weeks. At the moment, these protests are extremely widespread, but very spontaneous. They are slowly evolving from the immediate issue of women's dress and the brutality of reinforcing this, which, by the way, under Rouhani was lessened. So there was no on the street in the city enforcement of hijab under Rouhani, very deliberately, because of the enormous economic pressure that the population in Iran already is under. Now, if these protests devolve into a wider range of issues, democracy, freedom of speech, possibly a change of the regime or the government as it is, and at the same time there appears a coordinating element, particularly if that coordinating element is in Iran, and it could be online. There was no obvious leader of the Green Movement apart from the two candidates, but they were not involved in organizing the Green Movement. This was all done online. That is the reason also why the Iranian regime partially turned off the internet right now to prevent this. But if it's possible, then the regime looks not at a couple of weeks and violent challenge, then it looks at a very strategic challenge. And then you will see a phase where violence actually goes down while the regime regroups and rethinks its strategy. If we don't see this happening, wider issues, greater coordination, violence go down, unfortunately, very likely, what will happen is that we are looking for a few very, very bloody weeks where a lot of people are going to get hurt and killed and arrested. And then the protests will fizzle out. Potentially, because this is what the regime always does in the aftermath of these protests, they will address one of the issues, most likely the hijab issue, will loosen up a little bit again on the controls of these, when they can do this within a day. It's just the order to issue, and then it will continue. So we are a little bit at a crossroad here, where at the moment, the chances for success are still on the regime side because the coordinating element is missing. But with this amount of energy and the coordinating element, then this becomes a very serious challenge to the regime.
Hans, thank you as always for a very in-depth and at the same time, very succinct explanation of some very complex issues. Thank you again for joining us to talk with us about this today.
Always a pleasure to be with you.